Good evening and welcome to this month's Whisky Me live tasting. I am your host, as usual, Tristan from Whisky Me. And this month in September, we are going to be tasting two fantastic whiskies. We have got Tomatin Sherry Cask 12-year-old. Very excited to share that with you and see what you think of it. And then we're going to be moving over to Uncle Nearest, our first ever Tennessee whiskey on Whisky Me. And we've only done, I think, one other American whiskey in the last year as well. So they don't come about very often. We're super excited to try it. Now, before we get started on Uncle Nearest, we're going to jump in with Richie Michaels at 8:15. We have a confession to make. We had a bit of a mess up this month with the labeling of our pouches. Now, you are holding a pouch that says Uncle Nearest 1856 on it. And in actual fact, the whiskey that we have sent you is a different expression, sounds similar, but crucially quite different, which is Uncle Nearest 1884. Different date, different whiskey. We're going to discuss the differences between those two and why it's important that you know the difference when Richie comes on in 15 minutes. But first of all, hands up, we made a mistake. It was an internal admin error between the people that design the labels and the people who buy the whiskey. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to bring in Scott Adamson from Tomatin, and we're going to kick off the tasting with this month's single malt Scotch. Hey Scott, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. How many times have you done one of these tastings with us now?
I want to say this is maybe the fourth time,
but almost as many as me.
It's the first time that we're pronouncing the name correctly from the beginning. We don't have to go over that conversation. So we're making ground.
Yeah, that's it. We have actually featured Tomatin. I think this is the fourth time. Of course, we've done it under two different guises because you've got Tomatin, which is the distillery, and then there's Kubokum, which is the sort of peated arm of the distillery, which is much smaller production, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so we've done. I want to say we did Tomatin Legacy maybe, and then we did Kubokum earlier this year, and we did the tasting at Blackrock as well, which was really fun, where we tried the full Kubokum range. So that was a lot of fun for members.
Yeah, I think the other Tomatin we did was the 12-year-old. Is it bourbon and cherry? It's called.
Yeah, the kind of core 12-year-old. So we've got something a little bit different this time around.
Yeah. So I mean, you know, our members may be indeed be familiar with you as they are with me, maybe even more so with you. And they can go back and watch the previous videos we've done. But let's do a kind of quick run through the Tomatin history and story because it's an interesting one, I think.
Yeah, I love the history of it. My background's history as well, so that's kind of my entry into whiskey and entry into Tomatin. And it's interesting, we had our ambassador program at the distillery a couple of weeks back, and I just kind of, my parting shot to them was the ambassadors need to find their thing that they love and then make that the content they talk about. And for me, it's naturally the history. What I think is fascinating about Tomatin's history is how much it's held a mirror up to the wider trends of the whiskey industry of that time and almost taken things to the extreme. So long history of illicit distillation right through until the 1800s. And then it joins the fray as a licensed distillery in the 1890s, one of that group of distilleries that were founded in the 1890s in a really weird location. So it's right in the heart of the Highlands. If you go back to before the A9 and before the railway line, it was a pretty inaccessible, inhospitable place. But it was with the railway line being built in 1897 that a local businessman decided, let's build a distillery here. Pretty much crowdfunded it. We found an old document recently which had a list of all the original investors in the company and what they did. And, you know, you've got gentlemen, you've got farmers, but you've got like bar managers and hotel owners and things like that. So having a little share here and there. And it was all about producing whiskey predominantly for the north of Scotland. And as a result, it didn't really last long. It didn't have that big route to market. And so it couldn't really survive the slump of the early 1900s, the Pattison crash. But because it was quite new and because it was really easy to access now that we had the railway line, two families from London bought the distillery in 1909. And they made it one of the biggest distilleries in Scotland over their time of owning it. They started selling Tomatin to blenders. So from about 1910 onwards, in our books, our list of names like Haig, White and Mackay, Arthur Bell and Son, you've got John Walker, all buying our whiskey. And Tomatin goes into their blends. And as blend develops throughout the 20th century to become one of the biggest spirits in the world, Tomatin, it becomes the darling of the blenders. They're dying for it. We introduced a pretty unique business system, which was like a scalable slider. So effectively, the more whiskey you bought from us, the cheaper you got it per litre. It was the first distillery to be listed on the stock exchange and such like. So by the 1970s, well, actually by the 1960s, it was already the biggest distillery in Scotland. And by the 1970s, it was the largest malt whiskey producer in the world, producing about 12.5 million litres a year. All the way through that, we were bottling single malt as Tomatin, but it was a tiny, tiny, almost non-consequential part of the business. The business was selling bulk whiskey to the blenders. And then in the 1980s, as was the case 80 years earlier, the distillery went bankrupt. We had the big whiskey loch, and Tomatin became the first distillery since the Second World War to enter liquidation. So kind of triggered the big downturn in whiskey in the 80s and 90s. Again, though, our distillery was so efficient and so well regarded that we were quite an appealing prospect. And we became the first distillery owned by a Japanese company in 1986 when we were purchased by who were at the time our biggest customer, a company called Takara Shutsu. They were taking Scotch whiskey from Tomatin and blending it in Japan as Japanese whiskey, as is often the case even today. And they decided that rather than lose a supply of whiskey, they would buy Tomatin Distillery. Throughout the 90s, we remained responsible for about 10% of all the malt whiskey produced in Scotland. So it was still a big operation, but it would never go back to the heydays in the 1970s. And we kind of saw towards the mid-1990s, early 2000s, the writing was on the wall for bulk whiskey supply, particularly when you're not owned by one of the big blending houses. They've now got all their own distilleries. So we shifted into brands. Our first move into brands was with actually our blended whiskey. We bought a brand of blended Scotch called the Antiquary, and that became the first real thing that we pushed as a cased good. And then into the 2000s, we started developing the Tomatin single malt range. And today, it's one of the top 25 malts in the world. The distillery's won awards for Scotch Whisky Producer of the Year, Sustainable Distiller of the Year. So it's come full circle. We now produce a much smaller amount of liquid again, about 2 million litres a year, with the focus being on quality rather than quantity. Because we've got such a big site and large facility, we can do things incredibly slowly and still get a large volume of liquids. So today we've got things like our fermentation's the longest in Scotland. It's 168 hours, a full week long. Our distillation rate is around about half that of other distilleries in Scotland, twice that of other distilleries in Scotland. It takes us twice as long to run the spirit through the stills. We really pride ourselves on our maturation policy. So we have really, really well-trusted suppliers that we've developed over the last 20 years. We have our own cooperage on site. Every cask is fully matured on site. So the commitment now is firmly into making one of the best single malts you can get your hands on, but also within that, an incredibly diverse range of products, all the way from entry level to some of the most exclusive single malts in the world, and different flavors within that, crucially. We're not just one style of whiskey at a different age point. So that's kind of Tomatin in 8 minutes.
Fantastic. So has distillery still got the same potential capacity, like 12.5 million litres, or has some of it been demolished?
Yeah, so we can now make, if we went full on, we could do about 5 million litres. So when we were at the 12.5 million litres, we had 23 stills, we had 24 washbacks, we had 2 mash tuns. We now only have 12 of those stills, and we only use 2 of them. Sorry, not 2, 10 of them. 2 of them are not in operation. And the reason for that is our master distiller, Graham Unson, he came into the business in 2011. It was really interesting. His predecessor was a guy called Dougie Campbell, who had worked at Tomatin for 53 years. And so he continued to make Tomatin the same way. He knew every single rivet, nut and bolt of the building. He'd done every job. But Graham came to us with a background of working for companies who were active in the single malt market, not in the bulk whiskey market. So he had worked first at Scapa Distillery, but then moved to Glendronach. He was the distillery manager at Glenmorangie for about a decade, and he reopened Glenglassa Distillery. So when he came to Tomatin, one of the things he wanted to do is completely overhaul how our stillhouse worked. So historically, as soon as a spirit still was empty, it was getting filled. And then so that almost acted as a drain on the whole system. It would pull everything through. He moved it to a more balanced system whereby we would wait until fermentation was complete to fill the wash stills. We would wait until all the wash stills had boiled over, and then we would fill the spirit stills. So that totally overhauled our spirit production. And Graham will always say that it didn't make the whiskey any better. The spirit was always great, but what we know for sure is that the quality is far more consistent now.
And how would you describe the house style of the distillery?
Delicious. It's one of those ones that I honestly don't know why we don't sell it as new make in the visitor centre at the moment. It's a really elegant spirit, but complex within that. So it's light. It's easy drinking, but there's a lot going on. Very fruity, lots of apples, pears. I always get a rhubarb element to it. And then underneath that, it's got a sweet malty backbone as well. So almost like that base of a cheesecake. An old distillery manager used to refer to it as new make spirit in 3D because there was so much going on. You know, you could bring new makes in from other distilleries to try and create a blend, or you could have Tomatin, which has got all those flavors you're looking for.
I mean, that long fermentation is going to play into that in a massive way, right?
Yeah. That's an interesting thing. So our fermentation was always quite long, but we used to have two fermentation lengths. We had a 58-hour fermentation and a 110-hour fermentation. And what would happen was basically anything that was mashed on a Monday or Tuesday would be distilled by the end of the week. And anything that was mashed on a Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday morning, it had to wait over the weekend. And what we would do is the spirit made with the 58-hour fermentation would be sold to blenders, and the spirit made with the 110-hour fermentation we would keep ourselves.
Right.
But oddly enough, during COVID, when we sent everyone away, Tomatin's got its own effectively village on site. We've got 30 cottages on site, all occupied by staff of the distillery. So we had to open the distillery back up in a really kind of slow and meaningful and purposeful way. So what we did was the guys in the mash house would work 1 week, and then the guys in the still house would work the next week. And that started getting back into that week-long fermentation. But historically, that's what happened in Scotland right up until the Second World War. It was only after barley rationing was lifted in the 1950s that distilleries started to malt and distill simultaneously.
Interesting. So this particular expression, sherry cask, it's 12 years in Oloroso casks, is that right? Or
Yeah. So it's fully matured in Oloroso sherry casks. But within that, I've always said, you know, if you fully mature Tomatin 12 years in a first fill sherry cask, go and buy yourself a bottle of sherry. You kind of lose the distillery character. Part of that elegance is that it can be overpowered. So what we've done here is 70% of the whiskey has been fully matured in first fill sherry casks, and 30% has been fully matured in second fill sherry casks. So you're getting that full sherry maturation, but you're still allowing enough of that distillery character to come through so that it's not completely washed out by the sherry.
Yeah, makes sense. And I mean, because sometimes at younger ages, whiskies can be even more heavily sherried if it's all first fill, right? Because you don't have. I mean, if you think about it, once you've put a whiskey in a first fill cask for 12 years, and then you put another whiskey in there for another 12 years, a 24-year-old whiskey is kind of the same thing in a way. You know, you're sort of getting the second fill in the second half of the maturation term,
right?
So it's not as intense. Whereas this at 12 years, I feel like it's nicely balanced. It's got that. It's, you know, it's noticeably a sherried whiskey, but it's not overpowering.
Yeah, and I think that kind of approach we've had to balance on first and second fill, we've taken that at every step. So there's a balance of seasoned and Solera sherry casks there. There's a balance of American and European oak.
Right.
There's a balance of butts and hogsheads. So I think when we think of fully matured in sherry casks, you think of a very simple linear thing, but actually, even within that, there's so many variables
Yeah, a lot
that
of
you can
blending.
really tweak this to make it the flavor that you're looking for.
Yeah.
So for us, it was really important to do that. This is the first addition to our core range in over a decade. So getting that balance right from day one was vitally important.
Is there like a rule of thumb in regards to, like you say, butts versus other size sherry casks, or American oak sherry versus European oak in terms of expected intensity? Which one kind of gives the most sort of powerful effect, and which is lighter?
Yeah, so I think versus hogshead, that's what we'd be using, but versus a sherry hogshead, you're going to get far more intense, woody sherry notes from the hogshead. There's so much more contact between the liquid and the oak that surface to volume ratio is far more intense. So more of your spirit is interacting with the wood. You're pulling out a lot more oak aromas. I tend to find actually that on a sherry butt and a sherry hogshead for the same length of time, the sherry element is around about the same, especially maybe not after a couple of years, but after 12 years, you've got all the sherry out that you're going to get out. But more oak comes through from the hogshead than it would from the sherry butt.
Because it's smaller.
Yeah, exactly. So you're getting so much more interaction with the wood itself. When it comes to the American versus European oak, it is that sweetness versus tannin element. With the American oak, you do get that softer, mellow. For me, it's almost like a honeyed flavor when it comes to sherry casks. Whereas you go over to the European oaks, and that's where you start to get your spices and more of the dried fruit there. So it's not to say that one is better than the other; they're just different, and it's trying to balance out the two flavors to create that nice rounded thing.
Nice.
And then there we go, rhubarb from straight away. Yeah. Then within the kind of Solera and seasoning conversation, this is one I find fascinating because I often think that seasoned casks get a negative rap or a bad rap. But the reality of a seasoned cask is that we're in control of the whole process. And I find it's quite interesting that people want us to have control of the malt. They want us to have control of the mashing, the distillation, and all these things. But then actually, when you say we've got full control over the cask, it's seen as a negative somehow. For us,
with barrels, yeah.
Yeah, for us, we work with cooperage actually in Montilla called Juan Pino Toneleria, and we've had a seasoning program with them in place for 12 years now. So our casks get a 24-month, a 2-year seasoning with Oloroso sherry in Jerez, down in Jerez. The oak is to our specification, the toasting level, the style of sherry, all of those things are to our specification. So these casks are far more consistent. The flip side of that, Solera casks, you can have some of the most fascinating whiskies in the world, but you can also have real inconsistency. I think with a Solera cask, you buy them because they don't come about very often. But within that, you have to accept that the kind of consistency is at the discretion of how much of a history the sherry producer has kept of that cask.
Yeah. Oh, it's fascinating. We could get into talking about sherry casks for an hour, I should think.
Yeah.
I know people who've been to, I mean, I've been to Jerez a few times and done the bodegas, but I'm aware of some whiskey trips that have taken place, and people have come back going, they learn more about whiskey from a trip to Jerez than from trips to Scotland, because you get to learn so much about the coopering and the wood and the sherry and the extractions and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And you go into these bodegas as well, and you see all these casks, and you think, wow, look at all those casks of sherry, but they've already got a distillery's name on them.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite an interesting thing. You're all the way in the south of Spain, and you're seeing like your favorite Scotch whiskey brand on a cask. It's quite an interesting, eye-opening experience.
Yeah, it's funny. Right, we need to move on. So let's quickly have a taste of this. We're getting some tasting notes coming up as well. Leathery finish. I got a slight floral note in there as well. Just on the first sip, there was something kind of violety and floral and really nice. I mean, I've been drinking it all week, but and obviously, there's some of the dried fruit qualities there from the sherry and that leather, like Nubuck kind of character. And I think a lot of there's still some like orchard fruit and orange there present as well, like apple and everything, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
But something floral just popped up then, which was weird.
I quite often in the core Tomatin 12-year-old get a heathery element to it. And I think that's maybe carried over. I mean, the sherry casks used here are the same as the sherry casks that go into the recipe for the 12-year-olds. This is an extraction of that. The reason for developing this was we're out in the market quite a lot, and we're often asking, what's missing? What's missing either from our range or what's missing from the market? And the feedback we were getting is that people wanted an affordable and accessible and an approachable sherry matured whiskey. I think sherry matured whiskey is incredibly popular to the point that a lot of your favorite brands are on allocation. And so you get to this time of year and all the stock's sold out. So we wanted to add something into that. And I think by taking that element of the Tomatin 12-year-old, really focusing on it, for me, it is all those big dried fruit, Christmas cake, honey elements. But as you say, the orchard fruit's there, the rhubarb's there. It's that kind of, it's that apple crumble, rhubarb crumble flavor for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're coming into the perfect time of year for this whiskey, I think, aren't we? As the nights get closer and, the apples are falling off the trees. We're starting to think about Christmas as basically that in a glass, right?
Yeah. This is the whiskey you want to be drinking when you're wrapping all those presents.
Indeed, yeah. And like you said, the price is great. I mean, it's like £45 a bottle or something.
Yeah.
That's fantastic for, probably a 12-year-old age statement, well-integrated sherry cask whiskey.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Well, look, thanks, Scott. Hang on, if you will. We're going to bring Richie in now and talk about Uncle Nearest. Hey, Richie.
Hi, guys. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for hanging in there.
No problem at all.
Where are we speaking to you from tonight? Where are you?
I'm in Hollywood right now.
Oh, of course.
So I'm
Hollywood.
all the way on the west coast of the US.
Wow. What? Well, it must be like midday, is it?
It is. Yeah, it's lunchtime here, 12:23 p.m. So.
Nice. Oh, it's time for a whiskey then, right?
Right on time, fellas.
Oh, cool. Right. Well, look, this is fantastic to have this brand of Whiskey Me. We're really excited about it. Like I say, first Tennessee whiskey. For anyone, we've had a few people join since the start. So just to kind of disgrace myself again, we've labeled this month's World Whiskey incorrectly. It's Uncle Nearest, but it's not the 1856 expression. It's the 1884.
Exactly. We're drinking this one today.
Yeah.
Not this one.
So your tasting card and label is wrong, but there's nothing wrong with what you got in the pouch or this whiskey. So I feel like this month's theme is history because Scott's just given us a fantastic 8-minute history on Tomatin.
Yeah, that was great. I really enjoyed that, Scott. That was awesome.
It was great, wasn't it?
Yeah, it really was.
To compress that into 8 minutes is good. That was not a wasted word. So Richie, I mean, I know this brand's got an incredible history, and so although it is a new brand, its distant history is fascinating. So take it away. Tell us about the brand.
Before I jump into the history of this brand, I just wanted to comment on something that Scott said that I found incredibly interesting. Was you talked about that having control of your casks and things like seasoning. I kind of seen it as a detriment to some of the Scotch whiskey customers. And that's really fascinating to me as a whiskey producer in the US, because that's for our consumers over here, that's actually what they look at as the key point of innovation for new American whiskey items. We innovate a lot with our ingredients and our sourcing, but truly our real innovation that consumers look for in products over here is in the maturation, is in the manipulation of the cask, keeping it pure, keeping it real, no additives, but in using the amount of varieties of how we can adapt wood to create different flavors is truly how we approach our innovation over here. So very interesting differentiation.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, but let's talk about Uncle Nearest, y'all. Let's do it. So like we were talking about, this is a very historic topic and a very big piece of American history that our company has adopted since we started in 2017. But the history of Uncle Nearest, who was a real person, goes all the way back to the very early 1800s. His story is absolutely incredible. He is arguably one of the most important people in American whiskey history. I would say most definitely the most important person in American whiskey history who people don't know about. And there's some specific reasons of why people don't know about him, and you'll get to know them while I tell this story real quick. So like I said, he was a real person. His family actually originated in the 1700s in West Africa, and they were taken from West Africa to America. Like a lot of people in Africa during that time they were taken, enslaved, and moved to different countries. And Uncle Nearest's family was one of those families and those people. So they were taken to Maryland in the US. And we don't have a lot of information about his family or his early life. But we do know that he was born in Maryland, and he was born into being an enslaved person. Not exactly sure the date he was born, but we believe it was 1820. There's no birth certificate available for him, which is very common for people who are born into being enslaved. But we do have a record of him in the census of 1880 as being 60 years old. So we believe he was born in 1820 in Maryland, and his family had a history of a talent for distillation. That we also don't know where they originated from. But like most enslaved families, you had a particular trait that made you more valuable. And that's what you passed on to your descendants. So we have to believe that Uncle Nearest was passed on these skills from his descendants. And it was a family business, a family trait. So it actually becomes a very skilled distiller in his early life in Maryland. And he is redistributed from Maryland down to a town called Lynchburg in Tennessee, which, if you know much history about American whiskey, that town Lynchburg might seem familiar. It's a very whiskey-centric town in the middle of nowhere in Tennessee. And that's where Nearest was taken. And he was given the last name Green because when he was traded to Tennessee, he was traded by a slave trader with the name Green. So he adopted that name, and his name became Nearest Green. And he was making whiskey on a small farm distillery in that town of Lynchburg. To put it into perspective, the town in the early to mid 1800s was only about 500 people, and they had 17 farm distilleries in that tiny little town, which sounds a pretty incredible number, but that was actually a very common thing in the US, in the East, the Midwest, and the South of the US during that time. In the mid 1800s, US citizens were offered the opportunity to relocate and move west with the incentive of being given, just donated by the government, 100 acres of land. The deal that they had to kind of sign on with that was that they would use those 100 acres for growing crops. That was one of the pieces that they had to agree to. So now you have all these families that all own 100 acres of land, all growing crops. And that's too many crops for one family. So what most people would do would be to install a small whiskey still on that farm property, and all the leftover grains that they had that they couldn't use, instead of letting them rot and go to waste, they would distill them down into whiskey, because whiskey doesn't go bad. And it also helps with your storage as well. It takes about 14 square feet of American corn to make one 700 milliliter bottle of whiskey.
13 square feet.
So yeah, it was a storage thing and longevity thing. So it was very common to have a whiskey still on your farm property in that part of the US during that time. And that's where Uncle Nearest went to go and work and live, was on one of these farm distillery properties. What made his story change to be so incredible was the technique that he started using for his whiskey making. On that farm where he was working, it was abundant with a certain type of tree called a sugar maple. And Uncle Nearest took on the technique of cutting down these sugar maple trees, turning them into charcoal, essentially. So just lighting them on fire turning them into charcoal, crushing them down into small rocks, and then running the whiskey through that charcoal filter before he would put it into the barrel. And that's a technique that had been used in other places, but wasn't something that was communicated very well. Communication wasn't an easy thing back then. So it was unique to that area. Nobody in that region had experienced it until that point. The reason that Uncle Nearest started using that technique was because of his West African heritage. It was very common during the 1800s and into the 1900s to make your own charcoal to filter your water in West Africa. That was something that was just a common technique that was used every day that Uncle Nearest was very familiar with. It's actually still a common technique we use today. If you open up a Brita filter or a water filter pitcher that you have at home, it's literally just activated charcoal inside. It's an amazing substance at removing byproducts from distillation that we don't necessarily want in our finished whiskey. So it's an incredible technique to apply to the whiskey industry. You know, when Uncle Nearest started using that technique, he obviously wasn't familiar with the science behind what he was achieving. He just knew that something happened to the whiskey when he did that, and it made it lighter, softer, and people enjoyed it more. That was as far as his knowledge went. But people started enjoying it to the point where it became quite well known, and people would travel distances to this little town of Lynchburg specifically to buy Uncle Nearest's charcoal filtered whiskey. So he became quite well known around that area. In fact, we have records of sales from the mid-late 1800s where people are traveling from as far away as Alabama and the Carolinas to go to Lynchburg, Tennessee, which is hundreds of miles and probably was traveled on horse and buggy. And they did it with the intention of buying Uncle Nearest Green's charcoal filtered whiskey. So that's a pretty impressive thing to say.
And just to be clear, this wasn't his own distillery. This, I presume, was Jack Daniel's distillery that he was working at.
This was the farm property that was owned by a man named Reverend Daniel Cole. And he was the one who made the decision to put a small whiskey distillery on that property, like lots of people did during that time. Mm-hmm. The link with Jack Daniel doesn't actually come around till the year 1856, which is why one of the reasons we use it on this bottle. Right. The first record we have of sugar maple charcoal filtration, which is now the legal part of what makes Tennessee whiskey quintessential. The first recording we have of Uncle Nearest Green using that technique is in 1856.
Got you.
So essentially that is the formation, the founding year of the Tennessee whiskey industry by Uncle Nearest Green in Lynchburg, Tennessee. But that is also the year when something else really incredible happened for American whiskey. And what happened was in that little town of Lynchburg, a young boy who was 8 years old in the year 1856 found himself in a very unusual home situation. He was the youngest of 10 children, and his mother died at 3 months old. His father remarried to somebody who had 6 children. So now he was living in a very small home, and he was the youngest of 16. He ended up living with his aunt and uncle in Lynchburg, Tennessee from the age of 6 to 8. And then at the age of 8, his aunt and uncle asked Reverend Daniel Cole if he could go live and stay on that same farm property where Uncle Nearest Green and his children were also living and working. And so that's where the link came, was that Jack Daniel at the age of 8 years old in the year 1856 went to live on that same farm as Uncle Nearest Green and his children. And while he was working there to earn his keep, to say, he had to work. He had to work to be able to live and stay there as a child. And the work that he did was alongside Uncle Nearest Green's children by helping in the distillery. That gives you a sense that we didn't have any kind of OSHA or high regulations back then. We had 8-year-olds working in the distillery, start them young. And so he did. So he did that for the next 11 years, from the age of 8 to 19. Jack lived on that small farm property with Uncle Nearest Green and his children. Uncle Nearest took him under his wing and essentially raised him and taught him everything about life. And a huge part of that was how to make whiskey. To tie in the Jack Daniel story and how that becomes so prevalent is that when Jack was then 19, Reverend Call, who owned the farm and the distillery, he actually had to sell the distillery property. We were coming into the temperance movement, which is the start of prohibition, and he was a reverend. His wife was very pro-temperance, so a family decision was to abandon the whiskey distillery. Nearest Green didn't want to purchase it. He was a free man. He wasn't enslaved at this point, but he didn't want to purchase the distillery. So Jack actually borrowed the money from Reverend Call and Nearest to purchase the distillery and register it in his own name. What became so significant about that moment was that he actually noted on his distillery registry with the county that his distiller was a man named Nearest Green. That became the first recording of an African-American distiller in history. And that was truly because of his relationship between Nearest and Jack. Nearest had essentially raised this young boy for the last 11 years, and they truly loved and respected each other. There was many African-American distillers working at distilleries at that time. Many of the distilleries that were existing in that time that we still recognize on the shelf today, many of those brands, the whiskey was actually founded by enslaved African-American distillers who were never given credit. But the difference with Nearest Green and Jack is that their relationship was so incredible that Jack wanted to make sure that Nearest got all the credit he could possibly give him for the incredible whiskey making achievements that he had. If you fast forward all the way to 2013, that's actually when we got the laws of Tennessee whiskey enacted. It took all of those years before they were enacted. The laws of American bourbon came around in 1964, but it took until 2013 for the laws of Tennessee whiskey to come around. And essentially, they just copy pasted the laws of American bourbon from 1964 and just changed a couple of things. A biggest thing being, instead of bourbon being made anywhere in America, Tennessee whiskey has to be manufactured in Tennessee, meaning distilled, aged, and bottled within the state. But the biggest difference outside of that was that they added an extra law. And that extra law was that you are required to use Uncle Nearest Green's technique of filtering the whiskey through charcoal made from sugar maple trees before it goes in the barrel to age, if you want to be considered a Tennessee whiskey from that point forward. So he was kind of written into law as the founding father of Tennessee whiskey, and a man who's had 7 generations of his children work continuously at the Jack Daniel distillery. Still to this day, there's still 3 of them who work there today. And one more of his 7th generation descendants who works for us at Uncle Nearest and is actually the lady who blends all of our whiskey. Her name's Victoria Edie Butler. She's the great granddaughter of Nearest Green, and she's the one, our master blender, who puts every drop that goes into every bottle that we produce.
Nice. Great story. It's amazing. And like you say, so fundamental to the Tennessee whiskey classification. I mean, he kind of almost single-handedly invented it there, well, especially the key component of it, that being the Lincoln County charcoal filtering process.
That's right.
Along with obviously the fact that it's got to be made in Tennessee. So just going back to a few bits, why Uncle and why Nearest? Because his name was actually Nathan, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So we have records. The only records we have where he's referenced as Nathan are official documents. So anything that is to do with the government or is to do with slave trading, he is referenced as Nathan. Any time outside of kind of official documents that we see him be referenced, he's always referenced as Nearest. So like my official name is Richard, but only my grandmother calls me that. So I go by Richie. So his preference, from the documentation we have, it's clear to see that his preference was that he liked to be referred to as Nearest. And then Green was from the slave trader who traded him from Maryland to Lynchburg, Tennessee.
Yeah.
And then uncle, that's actually a term of endearment that was prevalent in the South of America during that period of time. There's lots of people who, when you live in small communities and you're seen as somebody who's senior and revered and reliable and loved and trusted, a common reference is to call them uncle. So it's a kind of a colloquial term where you live in a community who sees you as a reliable, superior figure within that community.
Right, gotcha. Yeah, makes sense. I was just thinking about the Maryland thing and how rye whiskey was so prevalent there in the early 19th century, and Pennsylvania. And perhaps that was where he got his distilling, or his parents got their distilling experience and then passed it on to him, because that would have been like a hot spot of rye production around the 1820s, 1830s.
Absolutely. Yeah, it would have been honestly the hotspot because around that time, this was prior to a lot of people moving west for their 100 acres. So all of the major distillation was happening in that region during that time. You didn't see a lot of big operations coming in places like Kentucky and Tennessee until the mid 1800s. You had smaller operations coming around earlier than that, like Jim Beam started in 1796, which is pretty crazy. But a lot of the bigger operations during that time were actually in the Northeast. So a lot of Pennsylvania and a lot of Maryland and a lot of rye production.
So did Nearest live to be a free man? I mean, we've got the Civil War in the mix there, haven't we, around this time? So he presumably he gained his freedom, or?
He did, yeah. He actually gained his freedom during that period of time where him and Jack were living together. So that was actually not a very big transition in Nearest's life. The town of Lynchburg, Tennessee was a very unusual place during the Civil War in a couple of different respects. It sat in a location where the North and the South kind of collided. So it was almost a common ground. You could go a mile this way and have people who supported the South, and then you go a mile the other way and you have people who support the North. So that was an unusual location. And what that meant was that it was kind of a safe ground. And because of a lot of relationships in that small community, you didn't actually have a level of racism that was comparable to what you would see in most places in the US. And to put that into perspective, while Nearest was an enslaved man working on that farm distillery property, he was actually paid by Reverend Daniel Call, even though he was an enslaved man, and technically Reverend Call would have no necessity to do that. But Nearest was a revered man, and he decided that he wanted to respect him and pay him while he was working. Once Nearest became a free man, his pay was escalated quite dramatically. And by the time he retired in the year 1884, he was actually one of the wealthiest men in the county. So he was, his family was extremely revered and looked at as people who deserved credit and wealth. And at some point along the line, their story was forgotten. Well, actually, his achievements were forgotten. It was forgotten that the entire basis of the Tennessee whiskey industry is quintessentially formed from techniques that he brought to that town. So that's why our company started in 2017, was to revive his legacy, to solidify his credit and his place in American whiskey history.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about 1884
Yes.
and 1856 while we're at it. Just can
this
tell
one
the
right
difference.
here. Yeah, so this is the 1884. This is what you guys are trying today. This is named for the year that Nearest Green retired. What happened in that year is that Nearest's whiskey had become so popular that they had outgrown that little farm distillery. One really interesting fact is that Jack actually was not a distiller. Nearest was very particular about his whiskey making, and he was very protective over his whiskey making. So when they were living on that farm distillery property, he actually didn't let anyone else work the still. That was his job, and he was very proud of that. And so in the year 1884, when they outgrew that small distillery farm property, Jack had to make a decision. He had to find a new place to relocate to. And so he found a water source that was about 1.5 miles away from that farm. And it was a water source that had been previously used for another farm distillery that went just out of business. It shut down. So he took over that little plot of land and little water source and relocated the operation to that spot. And that is the spot where the Jack Daniel distillery sits today. And so that happened in 1884. But during that transitional process, Jack made the decision to maximize volume that they needed. They couldn't keep up with the demand. So he actually switched from a small copper pot still to a column still. And Nearest had never worked on a column still before. So that was really what spurred his decision to retire, on top of the fact that he was about 64 years old and had been making whiskey his whole life. So I think he had deserved it at that point anyway. So 1884, he decides to retire. Jack relocates to the spot where the distillery sits today. And so this whiskey is in honor of Nearest Green being able to kick his boots off and put his feet up and finally sip on a bottle of whiskey and celebrate his retirement. So the whiskey that we put in here to honor him, well, actually, sorry, Victoria, who's Nearest Green's great-great-granddaughter, our master blender, she wanted to honor her great-great-grandfather by making a whiskey that is as soft and easy to drink as possible. That's really what Nearest brought to the industry. The Lincoln County process makes whiskey incredibly soft. And so she wanted to honor her great-great-grandfather by providing an extra level of softness to that whiskey. Make it easy to sip for people who don't necessarily even sip whiskey every day. This could be approachable for them. So it's a recipe of 80% corn, 10% rye, 10% malted barley, which is a high corn recipe, but is very known for Tennessee style whiskeys. They're usually very high in corn.
Not as high as Jack Daniels.
All of the Tennessees are very high, but yeah, Jack in particular, it's all packed with corn. We can't grow rye in Tennessee. We just don't have the soil or the climate for it. So historically, everything was very, very corn heavy with whatever other grains they had available thrown in. So traditionally, very heavy corn. So we stuck with that 80%, 10 rye, 10 malted barley. It's aged for 5 years in a traditional 53-gallon American oak barrel. We get all of our wood for our barrel from the Missouri Ozarks. It's some of the absolute best American oak you can find. Just the level of vanillins and how porous it is just perfect for American whiskey making. And we let it sit for 5 years and then bring it down to 93 proof to go in the bottle. So it's an easy sipper, soft and easy, delicious.
Nice. Well, we're getting some nice comments. Yeah, chocolatey for sure. 70% chocolate, not 75, 65, 70%. Definitely chocolate's coming up a little bit.
Yeah, and after sipping on a Scotch, it's much easier to notice all of the sweet. Scott, you talked about the difference between aging at American style, using American style barrels, and then the maturation that you guys use. And the level of sweetness that we see come through in American whiskeys from traditional 53-gallon American oak barrels, the level is just so much more escalated in particularly the vanillins. American oak is just packed to the gills with vanillins. And if you don't char it too heavily, you can really get a lot of those out of the wood. So we just have much sweeter elements naturally here.
Yeah, I can taste the chocolate even now, like a minute after sipping in it. It just kind of lingers around like I had a big bite of chocolate a few minutes ago, you know?
That's great. That's great. And the other one that you guys thought you were going to try today, the 1856 here, this is a much more deeper, richer, complex American whiskey. It's geared towards a real kind of bourbon drinker's bourbon. So that one is just packed with stone fruit, dark chocolate, cocoa. Less vanilla elements are coming through. The stone fruit and the depth really is the star in that one.
And what's the different? Is it a different mash bill, different maturation?
This is actually completely different altogether. So our master blender, Victoria, she's Nearest Green's great granddaughter. Her palate is absolutely incredible, and she wanted to showcase her blending skills with this product. So she uses a blend of 2 different recipes. It's an 80% corn, 10 rye, 10 malted barley, and then an 84% corn, 8 rye, 8 malted barley, which doesn't sound like an incredible difference, but the slightest differences can make the most incredible changes during the maturation process.
So it's actually higher corn than the 1884 then, yeah.
It is, yeah. And they're blended in almost equal amounts. It's majority of it's 84% corn. So it's decently higher in corn. They both use the same type of corn. We use a yellow number 2 dent that has just a massive volume of fermentable sugars. So it's a really efficient grain, but it's very sweet. It's very, very sweet grain. It's what you would expect when if you opened up a can of sweet corn and took a bite of it. It's sweet like that. So so she blends 2 different recipes together into this and keeps them consistent as possible. And she's absolutely incredible at doing that. I would argue she's one of the best American whiskey blenders that's ever lived. She's won the American Whiskey Blender of the Year 4 times in the last 6 years, which is an unbelievable feat.
Wow, that is fantastic. And I will echo the words of some of our members. Great story. And where's the other one? Yeah, great story both tonight, which is probably why we've gone on nearly twice as long as we normally do. But there's a lot to get through there. And well, Scott, thanks for hanging around. I think it was a fascinating chat from Richie. I hope you enjoyed it.
I did enjoy it. I think it's a fascinating story. I think what's equally fascinating is how lost it was for such a long time, and to re-find it. I can't even begin to think of a Scottish version of that, where someone so important to the history of whiskey making has just been lost from the history books, and then being able to bring that back. That's really cool. It was a fascinating tale.
Yeah, it really is. And our company is just a fascinating organization as well. We truly stand for giving this man and this family everything that we believe they have earned over all of these decades and generations. So everything we decide is truly for them. We're very close with the family. He has about 160 living descendants right now, and we do everything we can to share our profits with as many of them as we can.
Amazing.
I mean, the brand is doing very well, right? I've got to think it's like one of, if not the fastest growing American whiskey brands out there, right?
Yes. We actually, in the US, we generally use 0 to 5 years to judge fastest growing, and kind of a point that you can get to be considered in that realm is 100,000 cases in your 5th year is a really pivotal point for a company. And the fastest growing brand previous to us was Angel's Envy. They hit over 100,000 cases in their 5th year, which was incredible. And then after our 5th year, we were tracking about 17% higher than Angel's Envy. So we didn't just become the fastest growing American whiskey brand of all time. We absolutely smashed it.
Yeah, there you go. I knew it was doing pretty well.
Yeah, and our whiskey's been doing really well too. And in terms of media and recognition, we've been the most awarded American whiskey brand the last 5 years in a row.
Cool. Fantastic. Well, so we've got the fastest growing American whiskey brand of all time, and formerly the biggest single malt distillery in the world, but still producing some of the best, I would say. So thanks, guys. Thanks so much for coming on and chatting with us tonight. That was really great.
Thanks, Tristan. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Tristan.
All right,
Good to
cool.
see you,
Thanks
Scott.
everyone for tuning
You too,
in. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you next
Thanks,
time.
guys.
Cheers.
Bye.